want to begin, and I'm going to go from far left to right here. Because there are four camps, not just two. It's not just a left-right. We often think of this as left versus right, or hawks versus doves. And I think that is overly simplistic. In fact, I think there are really four camps that we can identify. The first camp, then, I would call the far left among American Jews. The representative organization of the far left is Jewish Voice for Peace, JVP. The far left tend to regard Zionism itself, Zionist ideology, as either illegitimate. They claim that Israel, in their vocabulary, is a settler colonial state, so it's inherently illegitimate, or at best, Zionism is anachronistic. Once, perhaps, it was justifiable as a kind of affirmative action policy for the Jews. Now, in the state form that it's taken, it must be abolished. They regard Israel as the aggressor in the conflict, as the source of much of the conflict, as the aggressor. And they also tend to describe Israel as an apartheid state, a very, very critical characterization of the state of Israel. They believe then that Israel should be like other apartheid states, particularly South Africa. Israel should be subject to external pressure, sanctions, boycotts. And so the far left in the Jewish community embraces the global BDS movement. Some do so because they still believe in a two-state solution and believe that strong external pressure is the only way to compel Israel to end the occupation. Others, however, believe that a two-state solution is either no longer feasible or was never desirable, and they embrace a one-state solution to the conflict. So that's the far left. And then moving toward the center, we have the center left. The center left's representative institution is J Street. Unlike the far left, the center left do regard Zionism as legitimate. They see Zionism as a legitimate movement to achieve the national self-determination for the Jewish people. However, they believe that national self-determination for the Jewish people cannot come and must not come at the expense of national self-determination for the Palestinian people. In other words, they support both Jewish national rights and Palestinian national rights. So for them, Zionism is legitimate as long as it's essentially a liberal Zionism, as long as it's a Zionism that can reconcile itself with the presence and rights of Palestinians. They reject the far left's characterization of Israel as an apartheid state, but some would accept this description as more appropriate to Israeli rule in the West Bank. So they make a distinction on the far left, on the center left, between Israel in the Green Line and Israel beyond the Green Line. With regard to the two-state solution, they also differ from the far left. They argue that the two-state solution is essential and that it is urgently needed. And so a lot of the focus of the center left is to push for a two-state solution as quickly as possible, because they believe that a two-state solution is the key to ensuring Israel's future as a Jewish and democratic state. In order to bring this about, those on the center left do accept limited forms of pressure on Israel. So they are willing to support US diplomatic pressure. They call for American presidents to apply some diplomatic pressure on Israel. Some on the center left are also willing to support a limited boycott of Israeli goods produced in the West Bank. But they oppose BDS in general. They oppose broader forms of economic pressure upon Israel, such as an end to US military aid to Israel or any form of boycotts or sanctions against Israel. So Jews on the left then, and this is important to acknowledge, are divided. They're divided both over how they characterize the state of Israel today, they're divided over their attitudes towards Zionism, and they're divided over the legitimacy of what kinds of methods or techniques or pressures can be applied on Israel. Jews on the right are similarly divided. Moving now to the center right, we have as the kind of best known organization on the center right, AIPAC. AIPAC, I think, it takes the center-right position. We can also think of an organization like the AJC as being on the center-right. The center-right's view is that Zionism is right, full stop. Without qualifications, the center-left tend to qualify their embrace of Zionism. Center-right is unapologetic in its embrace of Zionism. Zionism is right, and in the context of the conflict with the Palestinians, Israel is the innocent party. Unlike the center-left, which tends to ascribe innocence and blame to both sides, those on the center-right see one side as responsible, that is the Palestinian and Arab states. They tend to blame the Palestinians for the failure of the Oslo peace process and for the continuing failure to reach a peace agreement. So unlike the center-left, which sees Israel as partly responsible, the center-right places exclusive responsibility on the Palestinians. As a result of this, they oppose any kind of pressure on Israel. Since they believe Israel is the innocent party, pressuring Israel would be unfair. It's the Palestinians, those on the center-right argue, that need to be pressured because it's their intransigence that is the source of the continuation of the conflict. They believe, when it comes to Israel's security, in a more hawkish approach, but not too hawkish. Not too hawkish. So, for instance, when it comes to dealing with Hamas in the Gaza Strip, the center-right tends to take the view that Hamas needs to be deterred through very forceful military action, but not overthrown. They don't want Israel to reoccupy the Gaza Strip, for instance. So limited hawkishness. And finally, they oppose any kind of pressure on Israel. Yet, they do believe, and this is an important distinction between the center-right and the right, that a two-state solution is desirable. Those on the center-right, AIPAC, AJC, and others, do embrace a two-state solution, do support the idea of a Palestinian state. And this distinguishes, crucially, the center-right from the far-right. The far-right, the organization that represents the far-right within the American Jewish community today, is the Zionist Organization of America, which actually was once a much more centrist organization, but over the last 20 years has been taken rightwards under the leadership of Morton Klein. The far-right do not support a two-state solution for a variety of reasons, some perhaps for theological reasons, but most for security reasons. Most argue that the establishment of a Palestinian state poses an unacceptably high risk to Israeli security, both now and in the foreseeable future. So they oppose a Palestinian state and support Israeli settlement, Jewish settlement in the West Bank, again, distinguishing them from the center-right. They're also different from the center-right in their hawkishness. They're much more hawkish, whereas the center-right want support Israeli military strikes against Hamas, for instance, but abjure the overthrow of Hamas. The far-right want Israel to overthrow Hamas, to attack and hit Israel's enemies as hard as possible. The discourse of those on the far right tends to be much more security-oriented than the Israeli far right. And this is an interesting distinction. When it comes to the Israeli far right, the language, the rhetoric, is one that tends to emphasize much more Israel's right to possess the entirety of the land of Israel, all of Eretz Yisrael. That Israel has both a historical and, as some would argue, theological right to control this territory forever. Those on the American Jewish far right, by contrast, tend to stress the security arguments. They tend to emphasize the risks to Israel were it to withdraw from this territory. It's not so much theology as ideology that shapes the perspective of the American Jewish far right, in particular neoconservative ideology. The view that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is really a subset of a wider civilizational conflict that is happening in the world today between the West and Islam, as they see it. So they essentially argue that the West is at war with Islam, or with Islamic radicalism. Israel is at the front line, is on the front lines of this conflict, and therefore, again, Israel cannot be pressured. So just as Jews on the left are divided, so too are Jews on the right. They're divided crucially over the issue of a Palestinian state and also over their willingness to criticize Israeli governments. The ZOA is vociferous in its criticism of Israeli government policies, including, by the way, of Benjamin Netanyahu government policies. We're very willing to take issue publicly with the Israeli governments, whereas organizations like AIPAC, AJC are much more reticent about public criticism of Israel. So having mapped out the different perspectives on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, what I want to do now is look a little bit into American Jewish public opinion about this. And what we need to understand when we look at American Jewish public opinion is that many of the debates in these different sides between left and right correspond to different subsets of American Jews, that there is an overlap between different social, religious identities within the American Jewish community and perspectives on the conflict. The most important divide, the most important difference within the American Jewish community is that between Orthodox and non-Orthodox Jews. Orthodox Jews, simply put, and survey after survey demonstrates this in their attitudes toward the conflict, are much more right-wing than non-Orthodox Jews. And by the way, this is also true in Israel as well. There's a stark difference of opinion, particularly when it comes to the issue of the settlements. Most Orthodox Jews support the settlers and support the settlement projects. And there are many reasons for this. One of them is the simple fact that they've actually been to settlements in many cases. They may know people. Many Orthodox Jews have moved to settlements. They have a personal connection in a way that non-Orthodox Jews have not. Many Orthodox Jewish youth spend a year in Israel before they go to university. During that year, many of them study in yeshivot in the West Bank or visit the West Bank while studying in Israel. So their connections to the settlements, both personal and religious, is much stronger. By contrast, non-Orthodox Jews overwhelmingly see Israel's settlement policy as a major threat to Israel's future as a Jewish and democratic state. So on the issue of settlements, there is a gulf of attitudes. But that is just one example of a much broader political, religious, and cultural divide that is growing between Orthodox and non-Orthodox Jews in this country, and indeed around the world, in fact. So non-Orthodox Jews are overwhelmingly liberal in their politics, liberal when it comes to their social attitudes, and democratic in their voting behavior. They consistently support Democrats in American elections, and although every few years some pundit comes along and says, now is going to be different, the Republicans are going to increase their share of the Jewish vote, it never happens, and I don't think it's going to happen this year either. They are solidly liberal, solidly democratic. However, American Jews who are Orthodox are among the most conservative and Republican voters in the United States. In terms of their social and political attitudes and their voting behavior, they are much closer to evangelical Christians than they are to other Jews. So there is a real significant divide here, which underlies a lot of the debate about Israel and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It's not just a divide, though, between Orthodox and non-Orthodox Jews. There's also a growing split between liberals and conservatives. Now, it's true, Orthodox and non-Orthodox also happen to be liberal and conservative, but non-Orthodox conservatives and non-Orthodox liberals are also increasingly divided. So in the American Jewish community, there is a small but growing segment of the non-Orthodox population who are politically conservative or identify themselves as politically conservative, who vote Republican. Obviously, the kind of standard bearer or the person who's best associated with this perspective is Sheldon Adelson, the mega donor, the single largest donor in the American Jewish community. So when we think about the divide within American Jewish politics today, it also mirrors not only a religious divide, but a partisan divide. And we know that partisan polarization is happening in this country. There's a deep split between Republicans and Democrats, and that is mirrored in the American Jewish community. And the final divide that really matters in the American Jewish community when it comes to attitudes toward Israel is the difference between younger and older Jews. Younger Jews, surveys show, tend to be more dovish in their attitude towards Israel, less willing to support the use of force, more skeptical about the effectiveness of military force, more supportive of concessions to the Palestinians, and crucially and interestingly, more trusting in the Palestinians' intentions than older Jews. They also tend to be more secular than older Jews and overwhelmingly more liberal. So young American Jews, being more secular, more liberal, and more dovish, have very different attitudes when it comes to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict than do Jews who are older. So that's the third divide, a generational divide. So I've talked about the differences between American Jews. I've talked about the religious divide, a political divide, and a generational divide. But I also want to talk about what American Jews still have in common when it comes to the Palestinian conflict. For the most part, the majority of American Jews are still centrists. Although we hear a lot about division and polarization, it's important to recognize that if you look at the surveys, most American Jews are still centrist. They are best described in the words of Stephen Cohen, who's an expert on American Jewish attitudes, as conditional doves. They're conditional doves. What does that mean? It means that, in theory, yes, they want a Palestinian state. They support a Palestinian state, but they're deeply worried about Israeli security and the risks that a Palestinian state will pose to Israeli security. They do not trust the Palestinians. Overwhelming numbers consistently, around 3/4 of American Jews say they don't trust the intentions of the Palestinians. Many suspect that the Palestinians are still not really interested in a two-state solution to the conflict and would really rather to replace Israel altogether. So, like those on the right, most American Jews do worry about the security threat posed by a Palestinian state, but like those on the left, they worry about the demographic threat to Israel if there isn't a Palestinian state. So there is a deep ambivalence. They're torn between their concerns for Israel's demography and their concern for Israel's security. They want Israel to withdraw from the West Bank, but they worry about the consequences of Israel's doing so. And there's this conflict then at the heart of many American Jews, this deep ambivalence. This ambivalence is also reflected in their attitudes towards Israel's use of force. So, on the one hand, they support Israel's use of force. They back Israel almost instinctively when Israel is at war. But at the same time, they doubt how effective this use of force will be. They don't think it will actually solve anything. So there's support for land for peace, but a belief that trading land won't really result in peace. A support for Israel's use of force, but a worry that Israel's use of force will only be self-defeating. So this is the position of many American Jews, and there is a kind of ambivalent centrism that is still very powerfully in existence. However, when it comes to certain issues, there is no consensus. I mentioned before the issue of the settlements. That is the single most contentious issue when it comes to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Survey after survey shows a divide over this issue, with roughly half of American Jews wanting Israel to withdraw from most, if not all, of the settlements in the framework of a peace agreement with the Palestinians, and roughly half opposing this. Similarly, today, if we look at the attitude toward a Palestinian state, roughly half support the immediate establishment of a Palestinian state, roughly half oppose it. So we have a divide, almost a 50-50 split. This divide has not changed as much as you might think over the years. In fact, public opinion hasn't really, there's an underlying stability when it comes to these attitudes. Yes, attitudes, public opinion changes as a result of a particular conflict, particular development in Israel, such as the outbreak of a recent stabbing intifada. But these fluctuations really mask what is underlying much more stability in public attitudes, and the stability, as I said, in terms of a split. What is changing then, I would argue, is not so much the public opinion about the conflict, but rather public discussion of it, public debate about it. What's changing then is that American Jewish public discussion of Israel is becoming much, much more contentious today, much, much more acrimonious. There is a very public and a very nasty argument happening within the American Jewish community about Israel. What was previously being discussed in the conference rooms of American Jewish organizations or in the living rooms of American Jewish families is now being discussed in the open. It's being discussed at Limmud. It's being discussed in JCCs. It's being discussed in the op-ed pages of the New York Times. It's being discussed in the American public sphere in a way that is new. And it's also becoming very, very acrimonious, very ugly. Those on both the left and the right increasingly vilify each other. This is a personal argument. Each accuses the other of endangering Israel's very survival. The right accuses the left of being anti-Israel, of being disloyal, of even being self-hating Jews, which is tantamount to the accusation of anti-Semitism. While the left accuses the right of being racists, of being fascists. So each side is using really kind of demagogic language against the other. The right blames the left for contributing to Israel's international isolation, for making Israel a pariah, and even for undermining Israel's security, while the left blames the right for supporting policies that they believe threaten Israel's future as a Jewish and democratic state. So there's really a mutual vilification of each other. The right has also tried to curtail, to prohibit the expression of left-wing voices and perspectives in Jewish communal settings. So, for example, there have been campaigns, organized campaigns in San Francisco, in Washington, D.C., in New York, to name a few examples, that have tried to suspend funding to Jewish communal agencies, such as JCCs or even federations, that host cultural events, like film festivals, that are viewed as contributing to the delegitimization of Israel. So if a JCC puts on an event that is seen as contributing to Israel's delegitimization, it comes under orchestrated pressure to stop that, with a threat to its funding, implicit or sometimes explicit. There's been concerted attempts as well to exclude J Street from some communal settings and platforms. Most famously, of course, there was the vote by the members of the Conference of Presidents of major American Jewish organizations to reject J Street's application for membership in that body. This is a body whose nominal charge is to represent major American Jewish organizations to the American administration, to the US administration. J Street is undoubtedly, whether you like it or not, a major American Jewish organization, but many of the members of J Street, although importantly not all, and certainly not the largest organizations, many of the members of the Conference of Presidents believe that J Street should not be a member and voted against J Street's membership. J Street has also found itself shut out from certain synagogues. It's employees not able to speak there. So there's an attempt to kind of silence some of these voices from the left. And the left, in turn, argues, in response to this, that there is a McCarthyite atmosphere, that there is an attempt to muzzle Jewish criticism of Israel, which I think is an exaggerated claim. I think, in fact, what we're hearing is not a silencing of Jewish criticism of Israel, but rather a growth, an increase of Jewish criticism of Israel. So if there is an attempt to silence criticism of Israel, it's obviously an abject failure. But what is clear is that there is an increasingly toxic nature to this American Jewish conversation about Israel. And this is having, I would argue, a pernicious impact upon local Jewish communities. And many of you have probably experienced this firsthand. It's leading to bitter, very personal arguments between members of the same synagogue. It's discouraging rabbis from talking about Israel to their congregations. Surveys have been done in which many rabbis say they are afraid to talk about Israel now, for fear that it will spark communal controversy. It's forcing Jewish community centers to avoid inviting certain speakers who they fear might be controversial, sometimes to avoid any kind of programming on Israel whatsoever, because they fear that it's bound to be controversial. And it's frightening many Jews from talking about Israel at all, even to their family members, because they don't want to get into nasty arguments. This is a pernicious impact, and it's because of this toxic conversation that we're having. Why then has it become so bad? Why has the communal conversation around Israel become so uncivil, so bitter? I think there's a number of reasons for this. First of all, obviously, we're living at a time of general political incivility. I mean, we only have to watch the Republican primary debates to be struck by the acrimonious tone of political debate in this country today. We're living in a time of rancorous political debate and intense political partisanship. And that's spilled over into the Jewish conversation as well. Another factor I would point to is the impact not only of the American political debate, but of the Israeli political debate. The Israeli political debate has long been rancorous and uncivil. And some of that tone has entered into the American Jewish debate as well. A third factor I will point to is the impact of the internet, in particular, technology. One of the things, the internet's a wonderful thing, and one of the things it's allowed people to do when it comes to the conversation around Israel is it allowed many, many more people to participate in this conversation. In a sense, what the internet has done is it's democratized the American Jewish public sphere. In the past, the American Jewish conversation around Israel was dominated by a few major organizations. They really shaped the communal conversation. Now, on the other hand, the internet has allowed many more people to participate in the conversation. You can set up a website. You can establish your own blog. You can make your voice known and heard in ways that were hardly possible in the past. That's all to the good. But at the same time, what the internet has done has allowed a kind of shrillness to enter political discussion and debate, in particular because of the anonymity and the instantaneity of the internet. It allows people to speak in ways that they wouldn't do if they were addressing each other necessarily in person, because they can do so anonymously. And sometimes their first reaction is often a very angry reaction, an emotional reaction, and they express that in talkbacks or in blogs. And the other thing that the internet allows us to do is to find communities online that reinforce our own perspectives. So particularly in our Facebook feeds, those of us who are on Facebook basically reinforce our existing views. We live increasingly in virtual communities of like-minded people. And this, again, reinforces our own perspective and creates a kind of incomprehension toward anybody else who might have a different perspective. And I think all of this has contributed to making the debate about Israel today so uncivil and acrimonious. And there's another reason I would point to, which is that when we come to talk about Israel and argue about Israel, we're not just arguing about different Israeli policies. We're not just disagreeing about what this government or that government should be doing. We're also disagreeing about the very legitimacy of dissent. There's a debate at the heart of this about dissent itself. Can Jews in the diaspora criticize Israel? Under what circumstances? What kind of criticism is legitimate? And I think we have to acknowledge that aside from our differences over Israeli policies, there is also a deep and abiding disagreement over dissent itself within the Jewish community and over the legitimacy in particular of public dissent. So what are the questions here? The question, I think, the big question is, do American Jews and diaspora Jews in general have the right to criticize Israel? Do they have the right to criticize Israel? Some argue that Jews do not have the right to criticize Israel for the simple reason that they do not bear the consequences of this criticism. They do not have to live in Israel. Their sons and their daughters do not serve in the Israeli army. They do not have to live with the threats that Israelis have to live with. They don't have to pay taxes. So since they do not have to bear responsibility, they do not have the right to criticize Israel. Others argue, contrary to this, that diaspora Jews do have the right to criticize Israel because Israel is a Jewish state. Israel is a state that claims to act and speak in the name not merely of Israeli Jews, but of all Jews around the world. And as such, it is legitimate for diaspora Jews to criticize Israel because Israel, in effect, acts in their name, as well as in the name of Israeli Jews. Also, some argue that it's legitimate for diaspora Jews to criticize Israel because sometimes what Israel does affect them. Sometimes Israeli policies can affect Jews in the diaspora. This is a particular perspective that you hear among European Jews who argue that they can sometimes bear the consequences of Israeli policies. So that's one debate. The question then, the second question in the debate about dissent is not just do diaspora Jews have the right to criticize Israel, but is it a good idea to do so, which is a separate thing. Should they criticize Israel? Some might argue that even if diaspora Jews in theory have the right, they acknowledge that, in practice it is unwise. In practice it is a bad thing to do, largely because they argue that there's enough criticism of Israel out there. Right? There's enough people willing to attack and criticize Israel. Why should Jews add to it? And in fact, by Jews contributing to this criticism, some argue that it gives cover to the worst kinds of critics. It gives cover to anti-Semitism. It can promote the delegitimization of Israel because Israel's fiercest critics can say, you see, Jews are making the same criticisms. So the argument then is even though you have the right, you should not exercise that right. You should be careful in public when it comes to criticizing Israel. Others challenge this view and argue that public criticism of Israel is sometimes necessary because they argue it's the only way to get Israeli governments to listen or the only way to get Israeli society to take notice. Simply making some quiet expressions to Israeli diplomats or writing a letter to the Israeli consulate isn't going to get the job done, isn't going to get the attention of Israeli governments. What you need to do is make your voices heard, and that will capture the attention of Israel. Where do most American Jews stand on this debate about dissent? Most American Jews believe that it is legitimate to criticize Israel. The surveys show that they reject the view that diaspora Jews do not have a right to criticize Israel, and they also reject the view that they should not criticize Israel, that it's impolitic to do so. The really contentious issue, the thing that most Jews are deeply divided over, is not whether public criticism of Israel should be allowed, but when it should be allowed. Under what circumstances should it be allowed? And how far should it go? In other words, can you criticize while Israel is at war? And what kinds of criticism is acceptable and what is off limits? Can critics of Israel challenge Israel's basic legitimacy? They can challenge Israel's policies, but can they challenge Israel's legitimacy? What kinds of tactics, what kinds of methods can they use in criticizing Israel? So, in other words, increasingly the debate about dissent today is over the limits of legitimate dissent. How far can this go? What is and isn't legitimate dissent? What kinds of red lines, if any, are necessary when it comes to criticism? Yes, criticism is acceptable, but how far can this criticism go? What kinds of groups should be included in the communal tent? In other words, how big is the tent? Can it include groups whose criticism of Israel extends to Israel's very existence as a Jewish state? So that's the debate today. And I would argue that there is, contrary to the claims of some on the left, that the American Jewish community is intolerant of all criticism of Israel. I would argue that actually what we see over the last number of decades is in fact a gradual, halting, reluctant, difficult, growing acceptance of criticism of Israel, growing acceptance of it. That there is more space for dissent today in the American Jewish community than there was in the 1970s or in the 1980s. And if we were to contrast the experiences of a group like Brera, which was a radical, critical group in the 1970s, with the experience of a group like J Street today, we can see this shift having occurred. At the same time, I argue that although the Jewish communal tent has got bigger, it's encompassing more diversity, it's allowing more criticism than it did in the past, it's still not an open tent. It's a bigger tent, but it's not an open tent. There are still limits on the kinds of opinions that are permitted within the organized Jewish community. There are still red lines, although the lines are moving over time. So where are the red lines today? the biggest red line is supporting BDS. BDS has become, the support for the boycott, divestment, sanction from Israel has become the new red line. You can criticize the occupation, you can criticize Israel's policies, but if you support BDS, that puts you outside the communal tent as far as most, if not all, American Jewish organizations are concerned. Another issue that tends to be considered an anathema is support for a one-state solution. Support for a one-state solution, as opposed to a two-state solution. In other words, support for ending Israel's existence as a Jewish state. And relatedly, support for a Palestinian right of return, which is also seen as tantamount to calling for the end of Israel as a Jewish state. These opinions are still taboo in much of the organized American Jewish community. But I think if we take a historical perspective, we remember that even support for the establishment of a Palestinian state, even the acknowledgement that there was such a thing as Palestinians in the 1970s was controversial. So what we see over time is a shifting of the boundaries. That's not to say that in the future it will become acceptable necessarily to call for the end for Israel as a Jewish state, but rather these boundaries do shift. What's red lines and what were once red lines are now acceptable, and I think we can expect a continuing erosion of those red lines. So I want to conclude then by saying, to sum up, that what we're seeing today is a profound change in the role that Israel is playing in American Jewish life. Israel was once, perhaps, arguably, our greatest source of social cohesion. It was the thing that brought us together in support of Israel. Increasingly, it's becoming the greatest force for polarization in American Jewish life, the thing that's driving us apart. And this argument about Israel is unlikely to die down anytime soon. It's not just going to end with a new president in the White House or a new prime minister in Jerusalem. In fact, I think the argument about Israel is only likely to intensify over time. It's likely to intensify as the peace process remains deadlocked, as the two-state solution appears increasingly remote, and as Israel faces mounting international pressure and even isolation. And so I think the real issue that we face as the American Jewish community then is how we can learn to deal with and better manage our divisions over Israel. Thank you very much. So I'm happy to take questions. Because this is being recorded, I'm going to repeat the questions for everybody to hear. Right at the back, sir. Yes. So the two questions were, do I have any ideas about how it could become more civil, how this argument could become more civil? And secondly, what are the implications of the demographic growth of the Orthodox within the American Jewish community? Great questions. So on the question of civility, I don't have any sort of magic formula for this, but I do think the starting point has to be acknowledging the legitimacy of political pluralism. I think if we can learn an important lesson from how the American Jewish community has learned to deal with our religious differences. In the 1980s and right through in the 1990s, denominational differences between Orthodox, Reform, and Conservative Jews in particular, were a source of deep, deep disagreement and bitter argument over issues like conversion and marriage. And yet today, I think a lot of the venom that once existed in the debate between denominations has gone. I think increasingly, the American Jewish community has achieved a point where it's come to accept, albeit reluctantly, religious pluralism. And we see this here at Limmud. But I think what has not yet been accepted in the American Jewish community is political pluralism vis-a-vis Israel, which is to say that we have to acknowledge that our differences are normal, even inevitable. And we should not expect unanimity of opinion. I think the period of where there was this wall-to-wall, almost wall-to-wall agreement when it came to Israel and its conflict with the Palestinians was the exception, not the norm. The norm, not only in American Jewish life, but indeed in Jewish life and in Jewish history, are vociferous debates and differences. And I think we've forgotten this. And we have this expectation that when it comes to Israel, we should all be of the same opinion. I think the beginning of civility is to acknowledge the legitimacy of difference. When it comes to the issue of the Orthodox, this is part of why this argument is growing, is because the Orthodox, who, when we talk about the Orthodox here, who number about 10% of the American Jewish population, we're including both modern Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox. Modern Orthodox, only about 2 to 3% of the American Jewish population. It's quite staggering. If you think about that small number, the significance that modern Orthodox have in American Jewish life today. Small in number, but very influential in terms of the organized American Jewish community. So one of the things that's happening is the growing profile, the growing assertiveness and confidence of American Jewish orthodoxy. And that is translating itself into a growing political assertiveness as well. And so I think as the Orthodox grow in confidence and in numbers, that voice will become stronger, and that it does intensify the debate. The big question is whether, if you look at the long-term demography, whether the demographic trends today, which basically show that non-Orthodox are likely to decline in number, while the Orthodox are likely to increase in their share of the population, eventually whether that will completely transform the face of the American Jewish community, so that by 2050, if you like, the American Jewish community will look very different than it does today. It will be much, much more Orthodox, more religious, and as we know, there's a correlation between religiosity and hawkishness. It will also be a much more hawkish and much less liberal population. So I think that in the long term is going to have profound implications, not only for American Jewish identity. We've always associated American Jewish identity as liberal and as secular, but I think for American Jewish connection to Israel as well. Israel is at risk of becoming an Orthodox cause, or a cause for the religious, and much less so for the non-Orthodox. Yes, sir. So the question is, where can young people in particular obtain more objective, balanced information rather than having the narrow perspectives that they may have been raised on or that they're hearing from friends? I'd like to say in college. I mean, I do generally believe that that is one of the most important functions of the college experience. I think in an age of polarization, in a time where people are increasingly retreating into the communities of like-minded individuals, it's in college where students should be challenged, where they should become aware of whatever biases or prejudices they come in with, and they should have them challenged. Unfortunately, even in college today, students are sometimes wary of that. They seek out instead those who already agree with them. And in fact, sometimes I think parents encourage that to create a sense of security and safety for their children. They don't want their children to be exposed to opinions that they might find deeply uncomfortable. And I think the whole purpose of going to college is, in fact, for students to be exposed to views and beliefs that they might deeply disagree with. And I think it's very patronizing to them to try to shield them from those. I think they can handle it, and they should be encouraged to do so. So I really think that that is the single best source, but I think it should begin even earlier than that. I think, from what I've heard, I went to a Jewish high school in the UK, and I've heard from many of my students who went to Jewish day schools in this country, and when it comes to their education around Israel, they're shocked between the difference between what they are taught at high school and what they then hear about in college. That there is a complete separation between the kind of critical discussion, not necessarily anti-Israel, but much more critical discussion that they're hearing about Israel in college, and the monolithic view of Israel can do no wrong that they hear in high school. So I think should happen even earlier than that. I think Jewish schools, day camp, summer camps, etc., should do a better job than they're doing in terms of Israel education, and less so focused on Israel advocacy. Yes. This kind of dissent and this kind of criticism is through debate and argument. I mean, I think the only solution to bad speech is more speech. I think the problem is the danger, the tendency that I see, and I think it's a very unfortunate one, is to try to silence those views. I think that's counterproductive, especially in today's age where you cannot silence an opinion. You can't ban a perspective because it's always going to be out there. People will always be exposed to it. And in fact, trying to ban it is absolutely counterproductive because it only ensures more attention for it. So I think when it comes to perspectives that challenge Israel's legitimacy or that challenge Zionism, I think one has to allow debate on that. I think part of the problem is that people do not feel confident enough to debate on these, because instead of actually learning about Zionism and understanding Zionist history, and that Zionism itself is a very diverse ideological movement with lots of deep and continuing arguments, people have a very narrow understanding of Israeli history and of Zionism, and so they don't feel well equipped enough to take on that other perspective. So if somebody calls Israel a settler colonial state, people are not prepared to understand how can we respond to that. Or if they describe Zionism as racism, people don't know how to answer those perspectives. I think the way to do it is not to ban those perspectives or expressions of opinion, but rather learn how to respond more effectively. And that's not through talking points. That's through actually education. So the question is, can I say something about the evolution of Israel's status from a victim to not being a victim, and how the collective memory of the Holocaust overshadows this debate? This is a very big question to answer. It's a very important one because it absolutely underlies a lot of this. I think one of the things that accounts for the shift in attitudes, and I talked about this yesterday and I discussed it in my book, is the notion, the notion of victimhood, of Jewish victimhood, which is very palpable and powerful for an older generation of American Jews who have a memory of the Holocaust or who grew up in the shadow of it, and that completely colors their worldview. There's the sense that Jewish existence is imperiled, that Jews are at risk, and that Israel is the guarantee of Jewish survival. That perception, which I think powerfully underwrote a lot of support for Israel in the past, is simply much less widespread among a younger generation of Jews today. Young Jews do not believe, mostly do not believe in Jewish victimhood. They in fact see Jews not as victims, not as weak, but as powerful. They have been brought up in an age not of Jewish vulnerability, but of Jewish power and amazing success. They see Israel not as embattled, but as strong, as the occupier, as the Goliath to the Palestinian David, not the David to the Arab Goliath. And so this debate about victimhood and the role that plays in Jewish identity, I think, underlies a lot of this. I think, in a sense, what we're seeing is a split between, on the one hand, those who do continue to think of Jewish identity very much in the manner of historical victimhood, and whose collective memory of Jewish history is one that emphasizes that, versus those, on the other hand, who tend to see Jews not as victims, but rather as privileged or as white or as the occupiers. And this creates a very different narrative of an identity of Jewishness today. So I think the way in which we understand Jewish collective memory and the way in which we define contemporary Jewish identity and the role that the Holocaust in particular plays in that, I think, is central to this debate. But that's one of the reasons why I think this debate is here to stay. Because it just goes to underline the point that this isn't just about what happened in Jerusalem last week. It isn't just about this piece of legislation or that piece of legislation or this action. This is a deeper argument about what it is to be an American Jew, what it is to be a Jew in the world today. Are we at risk? Are we strong? Are we powerful, or are we weak? Are we endangered, or is the danger our own power? These are the kinds of debates that really underlie, I think, the arguments that I've been talking about. Yes. I think there are many generational... So the question is there a generational divide in terms of perception of a clash of civilizations, by which you mean clash between the West and... Samuel Huntington. So the thesis that there was a clash of civilizations, in particular between Islam and the West, which was made famous by the late Harvard political theorist Samuel Huntington, is that a difference in perspective between younger and older American Jews? I think there is a slight difference in that younger American Jews have been raised, and particularly on college campuses, in a very multicultural environment. They're much more likely to count among their friends Muslims. They know Muslims. They go to school, they go to college with Muslims. They may know Palestinians. So I think in terms of their experience of diversity, for younger American Jews, diversity is part of their social life. It's normal. There's a kind of, I hate to use this very sociological term, hybridity of identity, in the sense of how they define themselves is in many ways as members of multiple communities, multiple allegiances. And I think, therefore, that the notion of a clash of civilizations just is entirely alien to them, because their life, their experience, their lived experience, particularly on college campuses, is one of intermingling with people from many different civilizations. And in fact, the very notion of civilization, I think, doesn't really make sense to them, in the way that maybe the parents or grandparents were less exposed to diversity in that respect. And therefore, they can make more, see, and maybe are less acquainted with Muslims in particular. So it's much easier then to see Muslims as the other than it is for a young college student whose Muslim is their friend or a friend of a friend. Yes. So the question is, if I could comment on intersectionality and the Black Lives Matter movement and how that connects with pro-Palestinian activism. So I think this is absolutely part of the discourse, particularly on the far left, in terms of on the far left, in terms of the attitude toward Israel and attitudes towards Jews. There is a view that Jews are white, and white being privileged. Israel is, in this sense, white. And so this goes back to the point I was making earlier about the understanding of Jewish identity and of Jews being powerful. One of the things in college campuses today is and this has been happening, intersectionality is the most recent, fashionable term for what's actually been happening since the 1960s, which is the connection between various anti-colonial movements. So as Palestinian activism, or as pro-Palestinian activism, first started to emerge on college campuses in the 1960s, there were Black Power activists and others connecting the Palestinian struggle with other struggles and decolonization movements around the world. So this isn't a new thing, but it's not, I think, helpful to categorize this development as anti-Semitic or aimed at Israel. I think it's part of a broader conception of power and privilege. Now, it's like anything oversimplified. For one thing, it ignores the fact that many Israeli Jews are not Ashkenazi white, but in fact are Mizrahi. And so in that sense, it completely complicates the narrative of Israel being a white, privileged country. And it also overlooks the fact that American Jews are of all different classes and backgrounds. So I think it's a gross oversimplification, but I think it's incorrect and counterproductive to simply write off this development as something that is anti-Semitic or simply anti-Israel. I think there is among those activists a commitment to human rights, and as they see it, that commitment to human rights cannot be divisible. You cannot support human rights for one group and not for another group. And I think we have to actually recognize that and respond much better than we are doing, which is, as I said, the tendency to kind of write them off as ignorant or ill-intentioned. Yes? Yeah. So the question is about college campuses and the invitations that are given to speakers who delegitimize Israel or present a very one-sided perspective on the conflict, and how that's making some Jewish college students feel uncomfortable. So I'll answer this. I realize that I'm running out of time here, and I don't want to keep you any longer, so I'll answer this, and happy to take more questions in person. First of all, I think we have to be very wary. I think this perception now that college campuses are awash in Israel activity and anti-Semitism is really exaggerated. There are many different campuses. It's true maybe on some, highly selective liberal arts colleges, or it might be true on some University of California campuses. There are thousands of colleges and universities across this country, most of which students are busy trying to get jobs, build up their resumes, and they don't have time to engage in pro-Palestinian or indeed any kind of activism. So I think the perception of college campuses today as these environments for anti-Israel incitement is something that we need to take critically and skeptically. That said, of course, there are speakers who come who present, and I've heard them. And sometimes, indeed, there are professors who present very one-sided views of Israel. Again, I think it belittles and patronizes students to believe that they cannot respond to that and that they should not be exposed to these views. Maybe it does make them uncomfortable, but as I said, that's college is about sometimes hearing views that make you uncomfortable, and the best thing you can do is then go out and read a book or talk to somebody and say, wow, that really infuriated me. Here's how what am I going to do with it about that? But the idea that we should prevent these speakers from coming on our campuses or determine what is acceptable and what's not acceptable, whether it's in the classroom or particularly in our Hillel societies, I think is really an anathema to what college campuses should be and what the purpose of higher education is, which is, as I said, to expose students to a variety of perspectives, including perspectives that they might find very troubling and difficult. The only way to prepare people for a lifetime of differences where they are going to hear different points of view is in college. So I think we should hold off this attempt to try to impose a kind of particular perspective on Israel or shield our students from perspectives on Israel that we may disagree with or that they might disagree with. And instead, we should realize that they're mature enough to hear these points of view and that it's very counterproductive to try to ban them, particularly on college campuses. So I'm out of time. Thank you so much for your patience.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS, the Jewish Broadcasting Service, with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the JBS homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to GEM, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.